Since its debut in 1996, Capcom's Resident Evil series has become synonymous with the genre of survival horror. But with Resident Evil 2 2019, the series has proven yet again to be just as synonymous with revolutionizing video game remakes. Many game companies today are getting into the remake and re-release business, but Resident Evil has been a remake-centric series from the very start. The original game itself was, in fact, a remake, which in turn was an adaptation of a horror movie. From the original game, to its remake in 2002, to the complete redesign by later games in the series like Resident Evil 4 and 7, Resident Evil has always been a franchise in flux. And whether you're a fan or not, it's proven fascinating to watch in terms of its impact on the medium at large. Resident Evil 2 2019 is a complete remake of the 1998 PlayStation classic. Perhaps even more radically than the 2002 remake of the first game, the new Resident Evil 2 is a full-blown reinterpretation of its source material. Like the 1998 original, Resident Evil 2 2019 is a game about escaping a zombie-infested nightmare by solving puzzles and preserving supplies. Playing as either Claire Redfield or Leon Kennedy, you have to work your way through the ruins of the Raccoon City Police Department HQ, which was repurposed from an old museum, giving the entire facility an iconic uniqueness that's equal parts bizarre as it is politically charged. With this remake, Capcom have basically pioneered a relatively new approach to modernizing old games. It was a huge risk that wound up a kind of public experiment. Could a game defined by things like tank controls, static camera angles, and all the limitations of the late 90s get remade with cutting-edge technology in 2019 without something getting lost in the process? It turns out the answer is yes, if you hire people who understand the source material well enough and with enough intimacy, sincerity, and clarity. The developers at Capcom's R&D Division 1 have effectively boiled down the original's design model to its core concepts, and then built out of that a modern third-person perspective action game that still retains everything definitively Resident Evil 2. It's this balancing between the present and past, between nostalgia and progress, that makes Resident Evil 2 2019 potentially revolutionary as a step forward. Despite its backward-glancing, literal revisionism, this is not a game content with resting on its own laurels. Capcom have done an excellent job taking the right risks with challenging player expectations, and changing what some may consider sacred text to reassert what made it sacred in the first place.
Resident Evil 2.
The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Art has two voices, the violent passions of Dionysus and the structured reason of Apollo." Nowhere in video games are both put into dynamic tension as wonderfully as in Resident Evil. Like the best entries, Resident Evil 2 2019 embodies the same Nietzschean design aesthetic that's proven so foundational for the series at large. Horrific events always have a logic of strategic costs in Resident Evil, and none of the calculated supply conservation and puzzle solving would matter without the violence, viscera, and fear. There's a balance, in other words. You can't go on a shooting spree, consequence-free here, any more than you can totally avoid having to fight and to heal. Every moment of violence, however gruesome, has to be dispassionately calculated in advance, just as every puzzle can't be solved without forcing your way down horrifyingly deadly corridors to scuffle with freaks in the dark. Resident Evil 2 2019 succeeds as a reimagining of the 1998 original, largely on the basis of how well its modernization reaffirms this Nietzschean aesthetic rather than conflicting with it, as I initially feared that it might. Resident Evil 2 was originally cinematic in the sense of how radically far it took the concept of real-time game design. It was one of the first games with a sense of reality that was unmediated by menus or even a HUD. Character models reflected gameplay events organically, from displaying new clothes to visible damage. It was a big deal for its time. The lack of a decent aiming mechanic seemed then not only seamless and immersive, but also part of the game's approach to horrifying you. And the whole point was it made you feel weak, alone, and afraid. Resident Evil 2 1998 achieved this largely through gameplay and gameplay alone, with story taking a back seat. Even most of the plot details are clues that you find along gameplay investigations. Today, all of the reading involved may seem cheap, but in 1998, this was just a way of getting into your head and immersing you in the game's world. And today, the CGI cutscenes are hysterically bad, but then their use of mo-capped action figures was actually cutting edge. And while today the music may seem melodramatic, then it was incredibly effective at conjuring the vibe of a late-night horror movie. It struck a very delicate balance between agency and helplessness, or as the game composer identified as its central theme, desperation. Leon and Claire weren't action stars, they were supposed to be regular people who were as afraid as you were at home playing the game. And this wasn't a game that was supposed to blurt everything out immediately. Like the Souls series games today, Resident Evil 2 1998 was secretive. It was defined largely by the tension between ambiguity, difficulty, and discovery. Resident Evil 2 1998 had a unique, very well-defined purpose, and it pulled that purpose off with cutting-edge technology, moving the medium forward in the process, while raising not just production values, but the level of clarity and focus for the series. Like the 2015 remake of Resident Evil 2002, Resident Evil 2 2019 replaces the infamous tank control scheme of the 1990s with something new. But unlike any of the earlier remakes in the series, this one also reworks the camera system, which is a much bigger deal. The core design for the early games involved using static camera angles as part of the gameplay as much as the visuals. Enemies were concealed off screen, and much of the moment-to-moment gameplay restricted visibility as a way of ramping up the terror. This was a big question going into Resident Evil 2 2019. How were Capcom going to deal with the fact that third-person camera style basically breaks their entire game? I wasn't sure if it was possible to reconcile. The answer is in two elements and in how they work together: environment and controls. The setting of a citywide zombie outbreak has been actively worked into the level design by filling the RPD building with tight corners and lots of obstacles. But it's in how these obstacles are navigated that things get really, if not also subtly, new. Resident Evil 2 2019 uses a smooth and surprisingly versatile control schematic, particularly when it comes to movement, the likes of which I've never really seen before. While running, tilting the analog stick somewhat left or right will steer your character's torso, not their feet. This means you can juke and dodge. It's not that zombie dodging back then couldn't be done, it's that the tank controls, and their limit of only 8 directions, made navigating with tight precision a difficult skill to master. But that was okay most of the time then, because your run-of-the-mill zombie didn't do that much damage with a single bite. With this remake, however, zombies do much more damage, and especially in groups, and their hitbox range for grabbing is insanely wide. Only by tricking one into lunging the wrong way was I able to slip right by one anymore. I've had zombies spin around in almost a full 360-degree turn to bite me for getting too close. And they're also much smarter. And that should go without saying, but I want to focus on the way that they've been redesigned to basically trap you, flank you, and overrun you much more effectively than any Resident Evil game I've played before. And while I found myself missing Resident Evil 2002's German expressionism style camera angles, its moody, isolated gothic ambience, and its stronger emphasis on puzzles, of course, 1998's Resident Evil 2 was itself a much more action-oriented game than its predecessor. There's no question the remake of Resident Evil 2 improves on the original in virtually every way possible. The new Resident Evil 2 feels designed as a kind of happy medium that combines the heavier action of, say, Resident Evil 4 with the sense that you're barely scraping by that defined the earlier games. But what I found especially interesting was the way that this game, which debuted in 1998 as one of the earliest attempts at a big-budget Hollywood-style action game, has been remade with a lot of the techniques and advancements of other games that followed in its wake. I can detect in Resident Evil 2, 2019, traces of Metal Gear Solid, The Last of Us, and The Walking Dead, games that set out to emulate the 1996 PlayStation Classics approach to cinematic action. I have to say that Resident Evil 2 1998 was iconic in a way that I'm not sure its remake will be. Its decision to take the story into topics like police corruption, corporate power, and child abuse brought social commentary to the margins of a major release at a time when video games were only just beginning to do so. Today, this element of the remake is far less impressive. The same is true of Raccoon City itself, which could never be as mind-blowing today with our open-world sandbox games and their huge cityscapes as it was in early 1998, still months ahead of even Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And this gets at what bugs me about remakes, even great ones like this. It's releasing during a very different era from the 1998 original. This PlayStation-era classic was a bold and revolutionary experiment in cinematic game design for its time, but it was not anything like the cinematic games of today. Resident Evil 2 2019 is very fun and well designed. Essentially, Capcom have achieved the same concepts through a changed design, which is as perfectly rebalanced as a chemical equation. You'll still make mistakes while moving out of fear, but the mechanics are not so actively working against you anymore. I'd even compare the core gameplay loop of Resident Evil 2 2019, in some respects, to that of the Souls series, in that the challenge is well tempered by the intuitive controls. Further, it's just better action game design when the player has more precise controls like this. When you screw up now in Resident Evil 2, like in the Souls games, you know it was your fault. But that's not to say that they haven't also kept, in altered form, an important element from the original: the surprise zombie attacks, which now are hidden behind corners and winding corridors rather than merely 1 foot off screen and out of frame. There's still that necessary degree of the unknowable to how you prepare and what you're preparing for, in other words. You're never really sure what'll be around the corner. Even if now you can gradually expand your maximum number of items, you never really feel like you have enough of something. The entire game is a balancing act on your part between consuming ammo and health. And there's a variety that emerges to the moment-to-moment tactical considerations that is classic Resident Evil that's been beautifully reasserted here, which the majority of straight action games fail to achieve. And the use of environmental storytelling in the place of as much text as the original makes 1998 Resident Evil 2's sense of investigation more immersive without compromising the level of detail. Numerous cutscenes have also been reworked as real-time set-piece sequences to reassert the original's design principles better than ever. Leon and Claire feel like better defined, but also more present, player characters. And the original setting of a police station remains perfect for a zombie apocalypse story, but the remake uses that setting to an even greater effect. The Raccoon City Police were metaphorical zombies made to serve the will of Umbrella well before any actual outbreak. This nightmare is portrayed as merely the outward symptoms of a societal rot that permeates much deeper into the very institutions of our society than either Claire or Leon first realize. And this theme is much stronger emphasized in Resident Evil 2 than in 1, and in some ways that makes for a better zombie story. At first I didn't love the elements imported in from Resident Evil 4 because I was worried of what might be the result from the possible ensuing stylistic collision. But thankfully the new Resident Evil 2 is just the right amount of action, tension, and terror. It hasn't let becoming something of a prequel for Resident Evil 4 impede the much more important task of remaining true to the spirit of the 1998 original. Resident Evil 2 2019 basically improves on the original in every way. The remake may feel more actiony from the change to the camera and controls, but you're using your gun about as much of the time. And I realize the way that they've compensated for changing the aiming is by making individual zombies more of a threat and less numerous. There aren't as many of them because the hugely extended attack range means 2 or 3 is all that it really takes to block a hallway, not 5 or 6. And I also realize how faithfully the cinematic real-time concept has been reimagined here. The lack of most music, the replacement of reading with environmental storytelling, as I mentioned, and the extensively detailed facial animations and clothing damage are all huge contributions onto what the 1998 game tried to achieve. And now Leon has much more of a character arc, while story details like this jailed reporter or the overall themes like corruption as a contagion, it all feels much more topical today than it did in 1998. What's more, pivoting from the model of a movie to a TV show matches the very same shift in cultural relevance between the two forms that's taken place since 1998. None of these changes wound up feeling pandering, feeling like it was trying to make Resident Evil 2 something that it's not. They all felt consistent and faithful to the original concept, and that's what I really appreciated about Resident Evil 2 2019.